أجمعين. اللهم صل على حبيبنا ونبينا محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم في الأولين وصلي اللهم وسلم وبارك على نبينا محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم في الآخرين. All praise due to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, who knows what we reveal and knows what we conceal and even knows what the animals feel. We thank Him, we praise Him, and on Him we have reliance. It is to Him we only turn to for true guidance. We ask Him to send His peace, His blessings, His mercy on the best of human beings and prophets, Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, on whom be praised until the very end of our days. And we ask Him for steadfastness, guidance, mercy, and to never lead us astray, and for Him to save us on Judgment Day. So importantly, of course, this is something that's been gripping not just the United States, but also Muslims in the UK, Europe, all over the world, because the political spectrum has unfortunately become so polarizing that it, of course, has deeply impacted what Muslims do and the rhetoric Muslims have, especially with discourses online, on social media, and within our own communities, with the ever impending elections that are going to happen in the US, the one that just passed in the UK, things that impact not, of course, just us who live in these countries, but also Muslims globally, as policies in these countries, of course, impact the Muslims all over the world, wherever they may be. It's important for us to understand what is the Muslim perspective on dealing with such rhetoric. We've had very contentious discussions, and the reality is there seems to be a void in how to navigate these things. So it's very important to kind of give a little bit of a perspective on it, hence why we titled it Allies or All Lies, the far left versus the far right, and where do Muslims actually lie, and especially choosing who to vote for, who to ally with, and so on and so forth. These discussions, of course, are nothing new. There have been many people who have discussed this, and I'd like to preface this that, number one, we in Islam have a very, you could say, spelled out framework for values that guides us in everything. So the first and foremost, I think, narrative is that we are centered on the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So we are not right or left, but the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is centered through that, and then everything is viewed, whether it's right or left of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and Islam. Islam itself has a law system, a value system, a spiritual system, which is a cohesive unit. These three components, right? You have spirituality, you have the law, you have theology. And there are unequivocals in every single spectrum of these things. There's unequivocals in our theology, there's unequivocals in our law, and there's unequivocals in our spirituality. And then there's a realm where it is what's able to be derived or based on interpretation, known as ijtihad, or the scholastic legal reasonings of scholars or people in the community that can exercise a level of ijtihad. Like, for example, you're going to exercise ijtihad at some level in deciding who you're going to vote for, and so on and so forth. Now, Muslims, of course, have different perspectives and opinions and views on these kind of things. And it's important to just kind of set the tone and the background before we get into the discussion of what should we do, and etc. Number one is understanding history, understanding where essentially our political spectrum came from, and the political spectrum and the background of many of these entities. So when we talk about the far right and the far left, where, for example, does the Democrats or Labour, if you want to talk about Britain, and the Republicans or the Conservatives come from? What is the dynamic based on, and what are they actually basing their policies on now? Who influences them is a very important discussion to understand that. And this is why critically to understand history is to understand how it's going to pave our present. We're not actually forming much of our present. We're going to be forming the future based on the decisions that we're making now. So one of the things that's very important in the rhetoric that's happening now is sometimes we get caught up in the moment rather than understanding where some of these essentially movements and ideologies and political spectrums kind of derive from. And a very simple example of that is the Republican Party, for example, under Reagan, is not the same Republican Party of George W. Bush, is not the same Republican Party of Donald Trump. Same thing with the Democrats. Democrats are not the same as they were in the past, as they were in Bill Clinton, as they are in Biden and Kamala Harris, as an extension of that. So if we don't understand that component of how politics are influenced by special interest groups, AIPAC, for example, on the Zionist lobby that essentially influences so much of American politics in the world. And just simply just studying this and understanding its history and how politicians are essentially being bought up by lobbyist groups, whether it be pharma, whether it be foreign government agencies and ideologies and so on and so forth. This concept is going to be very difficult for us to kind of navigate without understanding that historical background. The other historical background, of course, to understand is when it comes to policies that are impacting social movements now. For example, like immigration and stopping immigration or being part of immigration, as you see in Europe and specifically in the UK, in the riots that have been started by these far right groups who essentially are saying that it's immigrants' fault because a person that was born in England happens to be Christian committed a crime. How does that even represent all of Christianity, for example, much less all of immigrants? So using that as a scapegoat and then completely not caring when there was a Muslim security guard who essentially saved lives by stopping a white criminal from attacking others. And then you have, of course, a discourse that has launched based on this due to some Muslims who've recently accepted Islam, essentially leading the way in these kind of discussions. You have a person like Andrew Tate and others who essentially sided with some of these far right rhetorics and created a storm in the Muslim community where people were divided in the idea of, well, he's a new Muslim. Why did you guys go and support such a person and platformed him? And of course, another extreme where people say we shouldn't have been happy for him to accept Islam to begin with. So you see there's a problem here where you have very, very powerful emotions creating divides in the Muslim community. So it's very important for us, at least the scholarly, to essentially give us a spectrum of understanding, navigating these kind of differences. Beside the history and understanding, it's very important to be led by knowledge. The Prophet ﷺ was commanded by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala even that in tanaza'tum fi shay'in farudduhu ila Allahi wa Rasul. That if you differ over something, you must take it back to Allah and His Messenger. So the Quran and the prophetic example is always going to be our guiding points for navigating these differences. So when people say we shouldn't be happy for such a person who's committed, certain at least unethical behaviors and so on and so forth from even accepting Islam, this is something that we should be very wary of. You never want to be in a position of saying I'm not happy for someone being Muslim, being cleansed and purified from that. But having said that, what did the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ do when somebody accepted Islam? He would basically pair them up with scholars. Not, unfortunately, what has happened. The dynamic of what we call like YouTube Dawah brothers, who essentially are amassing followings, and they're not at the level of qualifications of people who are actually within the community and essentially can give guiding points, who are in the pastoral sense understanding and have a background and are much older, but essentially being paired by individuals who are controlling the rhetoric. This is creating a huge, again, vacuum and void, which has caused serious problems. So our community must rein in and go back to our, principal foundations, is not to be led by these kind of things. Dr. Abdul Hakim Murad beautifully recently said is that we are not, on the theology of bling, essentially. This idea of like we're just following whatever is shiny and whoever speaks the loudest and whoever gets the most amount of views and whoever gets the most amount of clicks, but rather you should be guided by some principles that tell you don't listen and platform or seek your guidance from anyone other than someone who is qualified, someone who has some kind of experience and is led by some kind of principle and values. I'm not saying that people are bereft of that, but the idea is, the fact that we platformed individuals who don't speak for the Muslim community and then make some egregious mistakes and errors and then tries to justify that is a very serious problem on our part of even kind of listening to that. So the idea, of course, is always to go back to scholarship. And this does not mean that scholarship will give you the answer of who to vote for and etc. But the conversations can then be had based on some kind of knowledge base. And that's, I think, important, where we need to develop proper communication outlets. Like the modeling of disagreement has not happened, I think, healthily in our community, as you can see. There are people who in the past may have aligned with left political groups, and that has caused, of course, serious detriment as well. People who've made serious mistakes, and these are well-known figures in our community. We love, we respect, we applaud them for the work that they're doing, but they have made serious mistakes. Whether that's aligning themselves with left groups who essentially have kind of like murkied the waters of understanding of our value systems and what we believe to be wrong, and essentially allyship with them and on a political perspective on things like, for example, Palestine. People have lost this idea, notion of what is very clearly allowed and what is not allowed in Islam. So whether that be LGBTQ and its permissibility in Islamic law, whether that be the idea of what makes a male and a female in Islamic law within our faith's defined framework, and so on and so forth. So there were serious mistakes made because the political spectrum and the political field sometimes, when these notions change, those mistakes come out even more so. And the reality is that people have to come, and I think they have in some essence apologize for their positions and maybe change them. But this is the level of politics. It may swing one way or another, but the idea of us having that adult and responsible conversation is saying, hey, these were mistakes. This doesn't necessarily represent the Orthodox Muslim position, even if it was done by a famous speaker or so on and so forth. Let's have a discussion about it. So I think there needs to be more town hall. There needs to be discussions with activists and scholars and people in the political field of really seeing what the spectrum is. And this is even more so relevant to what you're seeing now. As you saw, Gaza kind of became a criterion, became like a furqan of what essentially the Muslims stood with. And if you saw in the recent elections in the UK, which they have a more dynamic and broader spectrum of political parties to choose from, you saw like a number of political candidates who were voted in because of this particular cause in and of itself, hoping to impact the larger spectrum. Now, I don't want to essentially fall into some level of doom and gloom in some essence, but we also have to understand that historical component is very, very important, which leads us to understand making informed decisions, making historically informed decisions, not just running off with your emotions, things being said like, well, how can we support a candidate who does X, Y, and Z, and then becoming single issue based kind of voters. W.B. Du Bois famously quoted this particular statement. He said, I actually will not go to the polls. This was something he said at that time. I believe that democracy has so far disappeared in the United States that no two evils exist. There's but one evil party with two names, and it will be elected despite all I can do or say. I mean, this is one of the greatest thinkers in terms of the civil rights movement in America, and his books are amazing. One of the concepts that he kind of wanted to ingrain in us is telling, if you base your understanding that there is evil and there is something that you must stand against, you will find that not one person will actually completely be able to, you could say, represents our faith, represents our standing, or represents something that we will essentially put our whole ideology behind, etc. So with that being said, of course, the concept of in Islamic law of what are the lesser of two evils is something that's discussed. And many Muslims, even scholars, will, in the previous elections in the United States, have always discussed this. What is the lesser of two evils? Because at the end of the day, whether it be foreign policy, whether it be even domestic policies that aren't really, we don't fully are represented by the left or the right, becomes a very difficult conundrum for us to navigate. So we have to be kind of, you could say, forgiving of each other in some elements, where people will make decisions thinking that something is lesser of those two evils, and say at the end of the day, you're going to be held responsible for what you individually choose. In the coming up election, this is something I've discussed with a number of scholarly figures, and to be honest with you, it's not something very easily spoken about. That's why it requires us to sit down and have more conversations. But one of the most important things for me is, people who essentially perpetrate the genocide and were involved in perpetrating the genocide is not something you can completely disappear. If you saw some Muslims even attending the Kamala Harris rallies and basically speaking out, you saw the kind of amnesia type responses of people yelling at them of why they're actually speaking out against, Kamala Harris still continuously standing and saying, I'm going to give a voice to this. And then a $20 billion arms deal is passed, which she is part of. So you have to understand that the average Democrat is going to become a single voter issue, or is going to be a voter based on, well, look at the opposite. Would you want the opposite to come into play? Completely kind of, again, denying the notion or idea that people who commit genocide should not be voted for, should not be propped, should not be supported. But this is the selective amnesia of the political spectrum, where people are going to vote based on these few things, whether that be abortion rights, whether that be what they claim to be minority rights, and so on and so forth. So it's very, very complex in that element. But it's very also shocking that you would see people on the left. This is not even the far left. This is just normative, who essentially silence the idea that people speaking out against genocide and will not vote for someone who has actively supported and is part of that. So this becomes very difficult, of course. And then you have on the other side, where we may align with some conservative values, social conservative values, whether that be in terms of some elements of the abortion components, some elements of what it means to be scientifically male or female, or even, for example, the issue of LGBTQ in terms of our value systems, and so on and so forth. It becomes very difficult to find also that when we're speaking for Palestine, neither of these two groups are essentially in any kind of way lesser than the other. And again, knowing history is very important to kind of navigate that. The idea of how Zionism crept into evangelical practices and became mainstream is very, very interesting. Dr. Ali Attai, who was a guest on Celebrate Mercy, has spoken about this on, I think, Blogging Theology, and also on a podcast with Dr. Shadi Al-Masri. And there's also books on this. And to understand, how do we talk to a majority who basically make up the Republican Party in America in particular? How do we speak to them and making them realize that this is actually anti-Christian? From a theological perspective, that the third temple that you guys are supporting, according to your own theology, it was supposedly Jesus, as mentioned in the Bible, as mentioned in by theologians, that you're supporting something that's actually anti-Christian. And then at the same time, of course, the theological beliefs of Zionists versus Jewish people, speaking to Orthodox Jews who are anti-Zionist, showing that anti-Zionism is not anti-Jewish or anti-Semitism in any sense, and of course working against the idea that Muslims somehow are anti-Semitic. I did a whole khutbah, which is online, speaking about how Muslims saved Jews throughout European history, whether that be the Turkish Ottoman Empire or others, who essentially saved them from the conquista of Spain, persecuting Jews. And of course, in World War II, they even were recognized for that, for some of the Bosnians, Muslims who saved Jews as well. So it's a very ridiculous notion to claim that speaking out against Zionism is somehow anti-Semitism. Speaking about that, it's very, very important to know also statistics. For example, from 2018 till now, in recent times, the evangelical support for Israel and the Zionist occupation state has dropped over 50%. It used to be over 82% support. They were the largest group, even more than Jews in America, according to the Pew study, that supported Israel. Now they're down to, as you would believe it, from the ages of 18, I believe, to 30 plus. I'm not sure the end number or age limit, but it's about 33% only support. And there's 24% support for Palestinians, the Palestinian cause, and there's about 46% or so that are unsure which to support. So this just shows you that there's a social dynamic change that's also happening even amongst Republicans. Okay, so all of this being said, you have the historical component, understanding where people essentially lie on this field, the communication component within our own selves, creating town halls, having the scholarly speak on the spectrums of which political components is important for us to essentially consider when it comes to politics, especially when it's national politics. You saw some of that happening in the UK, for example. You had the Muslim vote come together. In America, you saw the uncommitted movement, which essentially is saying you have to earn our vote, show us. And that has to become more and more organized. And you have the Green Party as well, which is essentially becoming a very loud and outspoken voice when it comes to the Palestinian cause, and speaking out literally verbatim and calling it a genocide. We have these other groups who don't even call it a genocide, don't even consider, of course, the number of people who have passed away, even, as you know, the bills that have been passed to mitigate the actual numbers that are coming out, and so on and so forth. One of the other things also to show in that communication is what I want to move in and end with is what should be the Muslim perspective. So there's a scholar who was asked by one of the students of knowledge. He said, the world, the way it's headed, what do you think is going to happen? Is it going to get better or worse? And as you can see how the world, is moving, and we're all afraid of a brink of war, of course, even more spreading in the Middle East in particular, and other places in the world. And he looked at that student of knowledge and he says, does it matter? Because our job will not change regardless. And that is actually a very powerful sentiment. Our job does not change regardless of the far left hating us because we don't espouse the same values they hold. So they want us as Muslims, as a minority group, but they don't accept us for our faith in Islam and the values that we hold at times, or the far right, who essentially is immigration in the sense that we don't want people from any kind of part of the world to essentially come to this country, even though if you look at, for example, the UK, many of those immigrants were invited by the British government. There's a really good book called "We Are Here Because You Went or You Were There." We are here because you were there, and it's a beautiful historical breakdown of how immigration even ended up in how immigrants ended up in the UK in particular, and speaks about how, of course, the British Empire not only just decimated because of colonization all these countries, but also invited all of those people that were within the empire to now build and help essentially have special services and their fields and so on and so forth to be of service to the British Empire. So people who are fifth, sixth generation immigrant Muslims, etc. It's very easy to say that they're coming here and they're bringing their own values, etc. Well, they were invited not only because they were a product of invasion, but also invited because they wanted to be service workers, specialized workers in the British Empire and British government. Very good book. Again, this is something to show through rhetoric. In the midst of the riots that happened in the UK, there was a beautiful example of where we should understand that we need to be between two different perspectives. One of them is we will defend, of course, ourselves. We will defend our places of worship. We will defend our families, and we will not allow violence to be done onto us. And this is something that, as you know, in the United States, we have First Amendment rights, and in the UK, for people to basically gather in order for them to prevent people to attack them. This is something that, of course, our Muslim community must take very seriously, but not allow vigilantism and, of course, people who may cover their faces and try to commit crimes based on that because they're hooligans or criminals themselves, or trying to hide their faces and trying to commit these acts. So there's no need to hide faces or protect yourself from any kind of facial recognition, because you're essentially just protecting yourself. You're not committing any kind of crime, and that should be something we should have an absolute resolute stance on, that we are not going to accept criminal behavior when we come to defend ourselves. It's absolutely not allowed. And then secondly, of course, you have the component of speaking to people who are absolutely ignorant. We had imam in the UK, a number of imams who essentially welcomed some of these far right people to come to the masjid and have a discussion, and then answer them based on the same things we just discussed in this particular session. The history, immigration, what do Muslims actually believe? Some of the things that you are fearful of happened basically on immigrants even committing crimes. The Muslims, or most immigrants, are actually not involved. And if you look at the statistics of, for example, white people committing those crimes versus immigrants committing those crimes, it's not even a comparison. It's not even possible for you to compare the two. And this is something to show that the fears being stoked are using the average person who has genuine concerns, genuine grievances, to essentially draw a bigger divide in the general community spectrum. And then we speak out against, of course, and say Muslims who unfortunately are espousing these kind of ideologies are of course wrong, and they should repent and take very serious precautions not to join the sides of those who are stoking even more problems, such as like Elon Musk, who are continuously driving into social media these voices that are causing a bigger and bigger divide, even spreading disinformation, which has been proven, and so on and so forth. So you don't want to be siding with people that essentially speak out against not only an Islamic perspective, but against Islam and Muslims in general. So I think those three components are how we navigate this. At the end of the day, you may have different even results, but as long as you understand that there's a spectrum here, and if Muslims understand and accept this spectrum, then we should be forgiving of one another, whatever decisions we make at the end of the day. For me personally, at the end of the day, I found it to be unconscionable to vote for either of these parties at this point in time, and to make our voices heard, to vote independent and a third party is something that we should seriously consider until there is some element of clear benefit to our community from either of these groups, because at the end of the day, they neither represent us. And with that being said, we have to, of course, understand that the levels of political involvement differ, and the impact that they could have from the local elections to, of course, the provincial or the state elections sometimes is much more impactful in terms of your own communities. And that's why it's so much important for us to still be involved and engaged in those elements. Whereas, as you saw in the quote on W.B. Du Bois, it might be the policies might change. They might just be veneered with this idea of acceptance. But again, the rhetoric of sometimes the left in this could be far more harmful in the right, where they're openly stating what they believe in, whereas they're creating a facade of their belief systems. So again, as you can see, the Muslim perspective has an unequivocal value system, which separates us from many people. In reality, our faith gives us clarity on what is right and what is wrong, and in many of these components. But the actual political action that's derived from that may have a spectrum of acceptability, may have a spectrum of just ijtihad. So again, scholastic reasoning. I hope that this has given you all some level of clarity. At the end of the day, you are not obligated to put yourself in a position where you have to be responsible. But at the same time, the decision that you all make is very, very much impactful. It is something that requires more discussion, but I hope that I've given you some food for thought, some level of discussion on some of these topics, maybe some resources as well. But I really, really recommend for you all to continue these discussions with those who you know, whether they be conservative, whether they have genuine grievances against what the harms of immigration that are being caused in the current policies, whether they be United States or they be in the UK or anywhere in the world, or to draw, enlighten people, to draw awareness to why just kind of like being blasé about our foreign policy you can't just brush it to the side, especially to those who are on the left and voting Democrat. These are all very, very important discussion topics. I think it's more important for us to just essentially be engaged and starting those conversations. And you'll find that regardless of whether someone's on the left, the right, the far left, or the far right, you can talk to people in the prophetic, way of communication to try to get points across is something that will win out. And this is something that was, again, done in Britain with the recent riots. And subhanAllah, you saw a massive impact and change. We can't lose ourselves by adopting the behaviors of those who are unprophetic, but rather when we understand that no matter how angry you might be, no matter how valid your grievances are against how people hate you, regardless of whether they espouse your beliefs or they're trying to enforce certain education policies that are anti-Islamic on your children, or whether they essentially have hatred towards you, or maybe even supporting policies that are what's causing the destruction in Palestine, you can still have a level of communication with certain people, at least get your point across and saying, this is where I stand and why I stand and why your perspective is wrong. So that kind of engagement has changed the lives of the most staunchest people in world history, and that is the Qurashi Meccans, who essentially were some of the most hateful and committed torture and punishment against the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and the companions. So if you can imagine how hard-headed they were, and yet the Prophet ﷺ impacted them with his behavior, kind of can give you an idea of where we should be balanced in our different approaches, inshallah. So with that, I hope that this has given you some level of introspection and also continuing the conversation, inshallah. And I hope that we can possibly host and have more deeper discussions of where should we should move by bringing a panel of people who are specialists. They're going to differ, but at the same time, we're going to be guided by our faith, inshallah. May Allah bless all of you. Allow us to be guided by the light of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ's teachings and the unequivocal principles of the Quran and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's guidance. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to bring light to the entire Muslim world and to remove the darkness of oppression and genocide and hatred and those people who wish to divide our communities even more so, to allow us to, as Muslims, to be united and to bring victory to our brothers and sisters in Palestine against the genocidal occupation, and our brothers and sisters in Bangladesh, and giving them a bright future, and in Pakistan and in India against oppression, and in Burma and in Sudan and all over the world where they are facing difficulties and hardships. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make it easy upon them and allow us to be mechanisms that will help and aid them, inshallah.